This is a quick review of the Asustor FS6706 NAS unit. Now what makes this NAS unit unique compared to others is that it actually houses up to 6 NVMe SSDs in here as opposed to traditional hard drives. Now I had a very limited time to actually take a look at this, and that's mostly my fault, but Asustor did provide this unit to me for review. It's out on loan, so I do have to return it shortly. But due to my other schedules and stuff, I had very limited time with it. But I can at least give you a rundown of its features and kind of some basic benchmarking that I had done with this device. So first of all, let's take a look at the unit itself. And you can see it is all black plastic here. It's kind of an interesting design here, kind of this parallelogram of some sort. And on the front, you can see here we've got just a single USB 3 port, type A, and then it indicates HDMI. That's the weird thing about this is rarely would you ever have to hook this up to a monitor, but in any case that's there. And then the power button itself is over here on the side. It's got this, turn it upside down, maybe you see it a little bit better. This weird design there. Almost reminds me of something like the Borg or something. And then on the other side you have similar type of thing, and it's got all those vent holes there. And then on the bottom you've got the 4 pads here, and then an access panel. We'll open that in a minute. And then that's about it. Now if we go ahead and take a look at the ports over here on the back, we do have the Kensington lock, SPDIF out, 2 USB 2.0 type A, and has dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. And I'll go ahead and take a look to see what kind of ports those are once we get inside, whether or not they're Realtek. I think they're Realtek. Then you've got a HDMI out up to 1080p. I'm sure probably at least up to 4K 60 probably. And then you've got the USB 3 type A port here, and then a barrel jack for the power. So here's the power brick that it comes with. And it is, get closer here, you can see that it's 12 volt, 5.417 amps, or 65 watt total, and it is that barrel type of jack connector. Now this system does come pre-installed with the ADM Asustor OS, NAS OS, and we'll take a look at that. But the intent is to try to actually boot off of a couple other distros like Ubuntu and TrueNAS, and maybe even OpenMediaVault. As you should be able to boot off the USB ports with that. And as I understand, there's also an 8 gigabyte eMMC on board, which houses the Asustor or the ADM OS. And I'm not sure if I can really mess with that, but we can at least take a closer look at that as well. Now just for comparison, here's your traditional Synology 4-bay NAS and your Synology 8-bay NAS. I don't have a 6-bay NAS because this does house 6 NVMe drives, just to give you a size comparison. And I go ahead and throw this on here. And clearly, and this is very light, very easy to carry around, and it's significantly smaller than these other devices. So that's one advantage it has right there. Now this NAS unit is powered by an Intel Celeron N5105 CPU, and it's an 11th gen older CPU, but it's a 4-core, 4-thread. Nice thing about it is that CPU tends to be used in a lot of low-powered applications, like a NAS device. And it's 2 gigahertz, 4 cores, 4 threads, and a 10 watt TDP. So it's not consuming a whole lot of power, and it can get the basic functions done no problem. However, that can be a little bit of a limitation here, and you'll see why here in a second. So I'm going to go ahead and open this guy up so we can go ahead and take a look at the SSDs, or where you'd mount the SSDs. And you just flip it over here, and then there are 4 screws here that you have to remove, and this whole bottom panel comes out. And this slides out. Then you notice here it's got this little USB port, and that is used apparently to go to the circuit board, which looks like it powers the fan that goes right here. And here are the 6 NVMe ports here. And they don't require screws, they have these little clips here. Now one thing I did find as I was messing with this, as you can see this one's loose here, this one keeps popping out. They feel a little cheap, but they do work. They're actually engaged. There's a closer look at the clip. All right, I'm going to load this guy up with 6 total 2 terabyte SSDs, and I have the 2 terabyte WD Black SN770 and 2 of the SK Hynix P41 Platinum. And one thing that I'd like to note is that I powered this on without any SSDs installed, and it won't let you get anywhere unless you actually have at least one SSD installed. So I'm going to go ahead and throw these in place here. Just pop this in here, and then push down. And you kind of have to push this back. There we go. Okay, so I have all 8 SSDs installed, and we're going to go ahead and boot up. But before we do that, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the CPU again. Now, the Celeron N5105, it supports up to 8 lanes of PCIe 3.0. So if you think about it, each of these are probably at least 1 lane of PCIe 3, so that's 6. And you have 1 lane each for each of the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. That uses up all 8 PCIe lanes, and USB are directly tied through a different connection to the CPU, and then HDMI is just the video out from the CPU as well. So it's really kind of taking advantage of everything that the CPU has to offer, but then again, you're also only getting about PCIe 3.01x speed, which is about 1,000 megabytes per second maximum theoretical through each of these ports. Now, another limitation that you're going to have is that since this makes use of MD admin traditional Linux RAID, that has a limit of about 200 megabytes per second by default on it, so you're not going to get any faster than that when you go to rebuild this. So I'm going to go ahead and throw this panel back down here. And then let's go ahead and take a look at the other side of the compartment here. And to access the top here, you just have these 2 screws right here, one right here and one over here. And so if you remove both of those, this lid slides right off. And the only thing you have here is the back side of the main board, right? And then you've got the 4 gigabyte of DDR4 that it comes with. Now I do have 2 16 gigabyte crucial DDR4 RAM chips I'm going to throw in there as well just to check, but otherwise I'm going to run probably exclusively off this 4 gigabyte RAM, see how it performs. I thought we could take a quick look at the product page for this device, the Flashstor 6 FS6706T. And it's an Intel Celeron N5105 CPU that we talked about, 6 M.2 NVMe drives, and the dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because Asustor actually offers other NVMe type NAS devices. This one is actually kind of the quote-unquote their lower end. And you go over to products here, you can see that you've got a few other options here. Now, they do have a 12-bay version, which we can take a look at. And that uses the same Celeron N5105 CPU, but it supports up to 12 M.2 NVMe drives. And it also has a 10 gigabit Ethernet port. And my understanding is that it's actually a RJ45 type connection, not SFP. And then the way that they get away with this 12 drives as opposed to just the 6 is my understanding it uses some sort of MUX chip so it can share the PCIe lanes. So that may affect performance a little bit, but it should be able to easily saturate that 10 gigabit Ethernet port regardless. Now they do offer newer versions. Go ahead and take a look at the Flashstor 6 and 12 here. And you can see it uses this AMD V3C14 processor. And again, they have the 6 and 12 version of M.2 slots. And then it also has a 10 gigabit Ethernet port. And I was curious about this CPU itself. So taking a look over here at Tech Power Up for that CPU, you can see that it is a 4-core, 8-thread, 2.3 gigahertz, 15-watt TDP CPU. But most importantly, it is a PCI Express Gen 4 with 20 total PCIe lanes. So that means on the 12-lane version, you should be able to get 2,000 megabytes per second through each slot. And so you're not going to have any restrictions there. And yeah, if you look here, it says it can support up to PCIe 4.0 x4. I'm assuming if you have fewer disks in there or whatever. And the 12-disk version does support dual 10 gigabit Ethernet too. So it's kind of nice to see. But in any case, we'll get back to the device that we're reviewing, the FS6706T. So I have the SSDs installed. I'm going to go ahead and boot this guy up. That's the other thing. You hear that annoying beep. I have not been able to find a way to turn that off in the BIOS or anywhere else. So you kind of have to live with that. When you first boot up, you can just plug the IP address of your NAS into your browser and you should be able to access its interface just like most other devices like this. But if you're not sure what it is, they do have the Asustor Control Center here. You can just scan for devices on your network. And sure enough, it will tell you the IP address. And I thought you were able to just double click on this, but connect, nope. But let's go ahead and plug that IP address, 192.168.1.14. And because it's a new device for new hard drives in there, it's going to give you all these terms and conditions, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I've read and agreed. And then it's going to take you through a wizard here. Once I got to the setup wizard, I set up just a single disk volume first so that I could quickly get in and evaluate the system and not have to wait for a RAID array to be synced. Now, I'm not going to spend much time talking about the ADM OS, as it is their common OS across NAS devices. I'm just really more interested in its overall performance. That being said, it does include a good suite of apps that let you do what you need to do effectively. The only option that I ended up enabling manually was the SSH, so that I could evaluate the RAID build process behind the scenes. Now, before I create any kind of RAID array, I want to go ahead and get a baseline benchmark of the NVMe drives and the M.2 slots. So you can see here that I do have those 6 SSDs installed here, all 6 here. And in order to do a baseline benchmark, I'm going to have to log into SSH. Now remember, under services here, under terminal, we activated SSH here. So you're going to need an SSH client of some sort to log in. And I like to use PuTTY personally. I already have it pre-configured here. One thing that I'd like to mention, that when you get into the command line through SSH, there are a very limited number of commands available to you. And so you kind of have to make use of what limited commands they have. It's not as simple as just doing a sudo apt install whatever. It just isn't going to work. I even had trouble just trying to find out what version of Linux this is, but using the dmesg grepping for Linux, I found that it's Linux version 5.1.3.x. But I was also able to determine that it is actually using Realtek semiconductor RTL 8125 2.5 gigabit Ethernet controllers on this NAS. So now we can go ahead and do a cat proc mdstat and see what it has set up as far as any kind of RAID arrays. And you can see here MD0 and MD126. It looks like those are the ones that are created by the ADM OS that it's using for its own use. And you can see it's spanned across all 6 disks. And then we have the MD1 here, which is associated with the data partition or array. And in this case, it's set up as a mirror RAID 1 and a single disk. And then it can just expand from there, depending on what you want to do. So now let's take a look at the performance of each of the individual disks. And we'll do sudo fdisk-l, and we'll grep for NVMe. And there's our 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 disks. And so now we'll just do a quick sudo hdparm-t dev NVMe 0 and 1. And there we get 858 megabytes per second. And I'll do the rest of these real quick and show the results when I'm done. Okay, so you can see here we've got 858 megabytes per second on the first 2, and then about 688 megabytes per second on the last 4. Now my thought is that these are probably the 2 SK Hynix, and these are the SN770 drives. I'm not sure why it's slower, but that's the performance we're getting through those M.2 slots. So it kind of roughly gets there for the PCIe 3.0 X1 speed of about 1000 megabytes per second minus any overhead. And let's just confirm that real quick. And yep, NVMe 0 and 1 is the SK Hynix. And so yeah, the first 2 were the faster ones. The SK Hynix, those were performing faster, and these were the ones that are performing a little bit slower. So I set up an SMB share on the single SSD volume, and then I did a quick 10 by 1 gigabyte file transfer, which maintained the expected 270 to 280 megabyte per second performance that you'd expect from a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. So now I want to take a look at the raw performance of those NVMe ports. So I set up a 6-disk RAID 0, and I'm going to go ahead and do a hdparm on that RAID array. So if we do a cat proc mdstat, we can see the MD1 RAID 0 array here with all 6 disks. And we can go ahead and do a sudo hdparm-t dev md1. And we're getting about 2253 megabytes per second. I'm going to go ahead and create now a 6-disk RAID 5, and we'll take a look at the performance that it can maintain to build that array. Just go over here to volume, and then in this case, we can either do remove or management, I think. If we do remove, it's going to remove. Okay, advanced setup, so it wants us to set up a new array. In this case, we'll do a RAID 5, single disk parity, and then we'll select every disk in the array. No spare drive, next. ext4, we won't worry about file system. And finish. Okay, so you can see here now it's synchronizing the RAID 5. And if we go over to Activity Monitor here, and the total disk throughput is about 167 megabytes per 220 megabytes per second. Now, one thing that I did learn is that MDadmin does have an artificial maximum limit put on it, about 200 megabytes per second. And that is adjustable, so we'll go ahead and take a look and see if we can get this to rebuild any faster. So we did a cat proc mdstat. You can see here that the speed is 200 megabytes per second approximately. I'm not sure why this is fluctuating up and down, but this is probably a more reliable metric over here. And so it's telling you it's running at about 200 megabytes per second. Now we can actually read what the limits are on the MDadmin rebuild, and go cat proc speed. And there you can see it's at 10,000, and that is kilobytes per second. We look at the max. So 200,000 kilobytes per second, or 200 megabytes per second. So that's what we're seeing in the rebuild up here. Now, if we bump up that max limit, we can do a echo. Let's set it to 2 million, which would be like 2,000 megabytes per second, which is realistic for these kind of SSDs. And set that to permission denied. Let's try a sudo. Permission denied. Okay, well, I found that you can do it this way. Sudo sys control. Now, if we go ahead and read that speed limit max, and it is coming back as 2 million, and now we'll do a cat proc mdstat, and there you can see it's running at about 240 megabytes per second. Let's see what it's doing here. Yeah, it's bumping up in speed over here too, so we're hitting up closer to 300 megabytes per second. And there we go. We're at 296 megabytes per second rebuild speed. Now, one thing that we'll notice, if we go ahead and take a look at the CPU, previously with 200 megabytes per second, you can see here that it was not fully maxing out the CPU. And in this case, it's actually pegged at 100% CPU utilization now. So there seems to be a limitation of the CPU more than anything at this point. But we are getting approximately about a 50% improvement over the 200 megabytes per second, but it doesn't look like we can get much higher than 300 megabyte per second rebuild speed. So if we say now we're rebuilding, and because it's going to be reading across every disk, it's going to be a maximum of 2 terabytes of data. Divide that by the 300 megabytes per second, so that's 2 million megabytes divided by 300 megabytes per second. That's total seconds divided by 60, so 111 minutes. Divide that by 60, so almost 2 hours to complete that rebuild of the array, or the synchronization of the array. And so if we do, again, cat proc mdstat, and there you can see, right, 108 minutes, which is a little under 2 hours, just like we kind of calculated. So I bumped up the maximum speed limit, and I've been letting it run for a while now, and you can see it's pretty much pegged at 100% CPU utilization, and the average load there is about 3.7, and you can see there we're running right around that 300 megabyte per second rebuild speed. Now, as far as temperatures are concerned, we can go ahead and look in Storage Manager, look at the disks, and you can see respectively here the 6 disks in the NAS unit here are 44 degrees, 41, 49, 42, 45, and 48 degrees Celsius. And keep in mind that these SSDs do not have any heat sinks on them. So because of the limitation of the M.2 slot, more importantly, the CPU in the system, there should be no need for heat sinks on those SSDs. Now, taking a look at the CPU itself, you can see here that it's running at 74 degrees Celsius while it's doing this rebuild. It's a little bit higher than I guess I'd like to see, but it's also not horrible if that's the maximum that it goes. And the fan itself is not audible at all. I went through a number of RAID creation scenarios within ADM, and you can see the results here. Everything above the yellow line is with the stock 200 megabyte per second MDadmin speed limit. And here you can see creating a 4x2 terabyte RAID 5, or creating a 6x2 terabyte RAID 5, and creating a 6x2 terabyte RAID 6. All took a total of 2 hours and 43 minutes, and you do the math, it ends up being right about that 200 megabyte per second transfer speed for a 2 terabyte drive. And then you can see here that the rebuild of the RAID 5 was the same speed, but the rebuild of the RAID 6 took a little bit longer. And then also did a scrub of the 6x2 terabyte RAID 5, which took the same amount of time as these other guys. And then I expanded from a 4-disk RAID 5 to a 6-disk RAID 6. I put both disks in simultaneously, and that resulted in about a 3-hour and 41-minute build time there. And then I went and set the speed limit of MDadmin to a 2,000 megabyte per second speed limit, and that resulted in only about 300 megabyte per second, just because it was limited by the CPU. And here we can see syncing and creating a RAID 5 took a little under 2 hours, but creating the RAID 6 took right around 2 hours. Rebuilding a RAID 5 was 2 hours. And rebuilding a 6x2 terabyte RAID 6 by removing a disk and replacing it with another one, it took a little over 3 hours in that scenario. And I'm also going to do a quick check of the USB performance. And what I have is a USB to NVMe adapter with a 2 terabyte WD Black SN770 SSD attached, and what you can see right here. And I have this folder with 10 1 gigabyte files here that I'm going to use to do a file transfer with. And to do that, I'm going to actually do it from PuTTY or SSH client, just so we can time the actual transfer speed. So here I am in PuTTY, and if we go ahead and do a df-h, we can see that MD1, which is a RAID 0 array, is volume 1, and then SDA2 is the attached USB drive. So now I'm going to go ahead and do a timed copy of share USB 1-2 and that 1 gigabyte folder over to volume 1. So it finished the file copy. So we transferred 10 gigabytes, or effectively 10,000 megabytes, and it took 18 seconds. That's 555 megabytes per second, which is not real great. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the opposite. I'm going to copy that folder of 1 gigabyte files back over to the USB SSD. And writing the files back to the USB was much faster. So again, we take 10,000 divided by 11.5 seconds. That's about 869 megabytes per second. And we can also do a HD parm test to compare it to, and we end up with about 705 megabytes per second. So let's say that you don't want to use the ADM OS, you want to use your own Linux distro or other NAS type OS like TrueNAS. I'm going to go ahead and go through that process here and see if we can't boot up off of that. And in order to do that, though, you're going to need a few things. One is obviously the Linux distro ISO, and in this case I'm going to grab the Ubuntu here, and then I'm also going to grab TrueNAS. Then you're going to need some sort of program like Rufus is what I like to use to install the ISO as a bootable USB. Then lastly, you're going to need 2 USB drives. One is an installer, and then one is that you're actually going to install the OS on. And so they should probably be at least 32 gigabytes in size. Obviously, you can use bigger if you want to, but in most cases, 32 gigabytes should be sufficient. So once you download the ISO, I have Rufus. Choose your USB drive you want to install the ISO on. Go ahead and select your ISO that you downloaded and go ahead and hit start, and then it will go ahead and install that ISO on your USB drive and make it bootable. So once you get your bootable ISO made, and then you also have your USB flash drive that you're going to install the OS onto, you're going to have to do a couple more things. And one, you're going to need some sort of keyboard and mouse, and that's what this dongle is for this keyboard and mouse right here. Then you're also going to need a monitor with an HDMI port, because that's what this guy has right here, right? And you're going to have to see what you're doing, because you have to boot into the BIOS at least to change the boot order. So I'm going to go ahead and install this is the ISO USB. Plug this guy right here in the USB 2 port, and then I'm going to do the one that we're going to install the OS on this USB 3 port here. There we go, and then I'm going to go ahead and plug the dongle for the mouse keyboard right here. So we're going to go ahead and power up with this guy here and start mashing the F2 key. That'll get us into the BIOS. And there we go. So since we're in the BIOS, might as well take a look around here real quick. And system information, Celeron N5105, 2 gigahertz, has a 4 gigs of RAM. Nothing special there. Firmware, advanced. Security, TPM, and then your boot menu, which is what you want to go to. Then you use the plus and minus key to adjust the boot order here. So The eMMC, I've already done this once before, so that's why this is here, but it's going to look like that when you get it, something like that. eMMC is going to be at the top, so you want to move that down the list by hitting the minus key, move it somewhere down there below the USB stuff, so that way it will boot off whatever USB drive is in there first before it hits the eMMC, so you don't want to boot into the ADM OS. And then we can just go over here to exit saving changes, and now it should boot off the ISO USB. So it seems like it's working. That's a good sign. So go ahead go through the install process. So here you're going to want to use erase disk and install Ubuntu, and then you're going to want to choose the USB drive to install it on. And you can see here that you could actually install it on one of the NVMe drives if you wanted to, but then you wouldn't be able to use that NVMe drive for additional storage, at least an RAID array. So go ahead and click the USB and go through the setup process through there, and it should go ahead and install. I'm not going to do that because I already created the USB drive. And once it completes, just go ahead and do your normal process, reboot, and then you should be able to boot into Ubuntu. Okay, so it looks like Ubuntu booted up just fine. Go here to the settings, take a quick look at it, and go down to System. You can see here, About, there's your operating system, there's the Celeron, 4 gigs of RAM, 12 terabytes of storage, and everything seems to be working fine. Let's go ahead and take a look at network and 2.5 gigabit connection. That's good. So just as a sanity check, let's go ahead and check the performance of the SSDs. So I ran the same HD PARM read test on these SSDs in Ubuntu as I did in ADM. And you can see here the first two are 858 megabytes per second, like we saw previously. These other ones are actually a little bit faster than it was in ADM, 742, 807, 742, and 807. So not sure what's going on there, but either way, it's roughly similar performance there. Now another thing you'll see here is the eMMC, which is the eMMC 8 gigabytes, and it's for some reason it's using a very little amount of storage space there. So it's showing up as an SD card reader, 7.8 gigabytes. It looks like it's only using about 512 megabytes of the 8 gigabytes of storage for some reason. But it looks like that would be available if you wanted to try to install a OS on there, although 8 gigabytes is really kind of limited. I honestly wouldn't do it. But you can also back up that if you wanted to do that. And in order to back that up, it should be pretty straightforward using the DD command. Sudo dd input file dev. Want to use the MMC BLK0 there. And then output file is going to be that mounted folder. And then we will call it ADM OS.image with block size of 16 megs, and we'll do status equals progress. That should do it. So you can see here the image completed just fine, and so we should be able to throw that back on that 8 gigabyte partition if we decide to install on that eMMC drive. And just for fun, let's take a look at the performance of that eMMC. So the results of that eMMC module for HD PARM is 290 megabytes per second, right there. And then I did a couple of file tests, the read bench for 4 gigs total. It's an 8 gig SSD, so I didn't want to stress it too much. And that's 319 megabytes per second. And then I did both a write test, 4 gigs and also 1 gig, and you can see the 4 gig was 62.7 megabytes per second, and the 1 gig was 95.3 megabytes per second. I then installed TrueNAS Scale, which had no issues either, and I also did a quick performance check of the SSDs using the HD PARM-T test again, and the performance of each individual disk were even higher than they were in Ubuntu. Next, I created a number of different VDEV configurations without any problem. And then to check resilver performance, I created a 3-disk RAID Z1, so 1-disk fault tolerance, with about 4 terabytes of total usable storage. Now, since the resilver process only touches existing data, and a blank disk will effectively take no time in order to resilver, I had to add data to the pool to test the resilver performance. So I ended up adding about 2 terabytes of data to the pool, and as I did that over the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, it saturated that pipe without a problem. Now once that data was finally added, I offlined one disk and replaced it with another one so that I could start the resilver process. Now surprisingly, the resilver showed a rate of about 2.4 gigabytes per second. And you divide that by the 3 disks, that's about, what, 800 megabytes per second, right? So that's kind of the max throughput of the PCIe 3 1X lane. I checked the SSD temperatures during the resilver process, and they ranged anywhere from 40 to 54 degrees Celsius. But again, these do not have any heat sinks on them. Those are more than reasonable temperatures for SSDs under load. Although as the resilver process went along, the performance started to decline a little bit. But ultimately, the resilver process completed in about 32 minutes and 48 seconds, or 1,968 seconds, for a total of 1 terabyte of data. And so that equates to about 509 megabytes per second average resilver speed. After the resilver process, I decided to run a scrub and just to check the total CPU usage and temperatures again. And you can see that here that the CPU utilization was only about 30 to 40%, and temperatures were well under control. So you can see here that the ZFS scrub has completed. It took about 21 minutes in total for 2 terabytes of data. We do a quick calculation. First, we'll check the total number of seconds. 21 times 60, 1,260 seconds. Total amount of data is about 2 terabytes. We'll just say 2 million megabytes divided by 1260 seconds. That'll give us 1,587.3 megabytes per second average rate to scrub that data. Without any SSDs installed, just the RAM and the main system, it idles at about 9.2 watts drawn from the wall. And if you're curious, at idle with 6 SSDs installed, the ones that I have there, SN770 SK Hynix P41s, it's idling at about 17.6 watts. Doing a ZFS scrub on this Asustor, with 6 disks installed, you can see the power consumption is about 30 watts from the wall. I thought I would mention that I replaced the stock 4 gigabyte stick of RAM with 2 16 gigabyte sticks of crucial DDR4 3200 RAM. The system booted up just fine and was detected in the ADM OS, Ubuntu, and TrueNAS. So here I'll go through a few benchmark charts real quick. And you can see here we have the 6 SSDs that were installed in the NAS. And I did run the HDPARM test on these, so it's effectively a short read test. I used HDPARM because it was common. It could be used across all 3 of these OSs. And you can see here that ADM is in the blue, Ubuntu in the orange, and TrueNAS in the green. However, I kind of redistributed this in a different way. I think it's a little bit easier to read. You can see here SK Hynix are in the blue, and the WD drives are in the purple pink. And then I have ADM blocked off here, Ubuntu, and TrueNAS. Now the weird thing is you can see here that SK Hynix performed perfectly fine in this NAS device, and actually TrueNAS, it actually didn't matter what SSDs were in there. They all performed about the same. WD was still a little bit lower. However, in ADM and Ubuntu, the WD disks for some reason were performing significantly less than the SK Hynix drives. And this 858 megabyte per second limit is likely due to the PCIe 3.0 1X lane. And just for fun, here's the 8 gigabyte eMMC performance. I did both a HDPARM and a FIO test, both from Linux. And you can see here that it's about 300 megabytes per second read. And then when we did the FIO write, we ended up with between 60 and 90 megabyte per second performance, depending on how much data was written to that eMMC. Now, as far as raw RAID performance, I did an HDPARM test with a 6-disk RAID 0, 6-disk RAID 5, and a 6-disk RAID 6. And here in ADM, you can see the results here. 2253 for the RAID 0, 2427 for the RAID 5, and 2446 for the RAID 6. Now, that's kind of odd because usually RAID 0 is the fastest, and when you have add parity, it slows it down. But for some reason, we actually had a slight increase in performance. Now, I did the same thing in Ubuntu, but only with RAID 0. And I did both HDPARM and then a FIO read and write test just as a sanity check here. You can see here that the HDPARM was only 1460 megabytes per second compared to 2253 in ADM. Not sure why that was. And the FIO did perform that much better at 1799 megabytes per second read and 1600 megabytes per second write. Now that doesn't really matter a whole lot though, right? Because we have a limitation by the 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port anyways, and not to mention the MD admin build speed restriction, especially due to the CPU. And then I showed this chart earlier in the video, and again I'll show it here for consistency's sake. And at the top here, these are when the MD admin speed was set to default or stock. In other words, I didn't touch anything. I just kind of went through and created these arrays and did a rebuild and a scrub and expanded from a 4-disk RAID 5 to a 6-disk RAID 6. And these are the resulting times in hours and minutes. So then I went through and changed the maximum speed limit of MD admin to 2000 megabytes per second. However, it ended up maxing out at only about 300 megabytes per second, primarily due to the CPU, because it just basically peaked out at 100%, so it couldn't go any faster. And so these are the resulting times for creating and rebuilding the arrays. So we did improve by a decent amount, but still not as much as you'd expect from an NVMe drive. Then when I get to TrueNAS, I went ahead and did that resilver and then a scrub. And just here for reference, just in a pretty chart, you can see that it took to resilver that one disk that had 1 terabyte of data. It took 33 minutes, or about 509 megabytes per second. And then as far as the scrub was concerned, it scrubbed all 2 terabytes of data in the 3 by 2 terabyte array, and that took about 21 minutes and resulted in about 1587 megabytes per second. So it seems that TrueNAS is actually able to take advantage of the performance of the disks better than MD admin can. Then lastly, I did a timed file transfer of 10 1 gigabyte files to both 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports in 3 different OSs, and they all pretty much performed around 280 megabytes per second, as you'd expect from a 2.5 gigabit Ethernet port. So one last nitpick here. I did find it odd that the SSDs are actually mounted underneath the device, right? So you actually have to flip it over to access them, and then they have the RAM on the top panel here. So it'd be nice to actually have the SSDs on the top and then make some sort of quick release or something for this. It just seems like it'd be a more convenient device that way. And overall, I'm having a hard time thinking of a necessary use case for this Asustor Flashstor unit. It is much smaller and lighter than a traditional hard drive NAS, of course, so I guess it could make for a nice portable unit. But at $449 US and NVMe SSDs are still not cheap enough for massive amounts of storage, it seems like it's for a very niche market. Now the Intel Celeron N5105 is clearly a limiting factor overall with this unit, not only from a performance perspective, but also only offering 8 slow PCIe 3.0 lanes. Now while the transfer speeds are limited to 2.5 gigabit Ethernet, it still would be nice to be able to take advantage of NVMe speeds and rebuild an array very quickly. Now that being said, it is good to see Asustor offering an option with an AMD CPU that comes with 20 PCIe 4.0 lanes and dual 10 gigabit Ethernet ports. And I'd like to offer many thanks to Asustor for providing this review sample. And I'd also like to thank you for watching this video, and until next time, talk to you later.